So we're happy to welcome today Eric DePlace, who's the Policy Director for the Seattle-based Sightline Institute. He's written extensively about coal and oil exports and is considered an authority on a range of issues connected to fossil fuel transport, including carbon emissions, railway congestion, coal dust, water pollution, and economics. His research also encompasses demographics, stormwater runoff, transportation, land use, and economic security. Previously, he worked with the Northwest Area Foundation, developing strategies to alleviate poverty in rural communities. He has a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming him with us here today. Thanks.
I'll show you a video, and then we'll dig in a little bit. I'm excited about
The
this.
Pacific Northwest stands at a crossroads. Widely recognized as a global leader in sustainability, the region now faces the prospect of becoming the primary gateway to Asian markets for massive new quantities of fossil fuels. Tar sands oil out of Alberta, Canada, Bakken shale oil out of North Dakota, and coal out of Wyoming and Montana. Big energy companies want to move it all to markets in Asia. But to get there, unprecedented levels of coal, oil, and natural gas would have to move through Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. How? An expanded Kinder Morgan pipeline and a new Enbridge pipeline. Thousands of coal trains running through the Columbia Gorge, disrupting traffic and spilling coal dust along the way. And hundreds more trains carrying volatile shale oil past our neighborhoods, schools, and homes. All to get this coal and oil to markets on the far side of the Pacific Ocean. Poll after poll shows that most Americans want to move past dirty energy sources, but these projects would instead expand our fossil fuel markets, fatten large energy corporations, and worsen climate change with their carbon-intensive impacts. How carbon-intensive, you ask? If all of these proposals to ship coal and oil, plus other projects to export natural gas, were to go through, we're talking the equivalent of 5 Keystone XLs. But between these and these stands us, the thin green line of the Pacific Northwest. Our choices in the coming years will impact our region's health and safety, even while they shape our planet's future. Let's make the right decision together. Share this video. To learn more, visit sightline.org/fossilfuelsnorthwest.
Okay, so that's a little warm up for the talk today. As Desiree said, my name is Eric DePlace. I'm Policy Director at Sightline Institute. We are a think tank based in Seattle. We work in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia on a range of sustainability issues, some of which are sort of conventional environmental issues, some of which are economic, some of which are social. And we've been working particularly on fossil fuel export questions for a bunch of years now. And I sort of lead our work on coal and oil in particular. I also do some work on carbon pricing and other strategies to reduce global warming, which I won't be talking about so much today, but if you ever want to have your ear chewed off by me, I'd be happy to talk about that stuff too. Before I begin, I wanted to give a quick shout out to the two folks in the back that Desiree also mentioned, Matt and Don, both a tremendous resource locally in terms of figuring out how to engage on the issues I'll talk about today. And then one other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hand around a sign-up sheet. Sightline Institute produces weekly research updates on the kind of leading sustainability topics of the day. I think it's a valuable resource, not only because I've worked there, but I read it before this kind of stuff before I even got there. And so I encourage you to sign up for that. And I'm going to sort of clumsily step down and pass this around. Who doesn't want free email? And with that, let's dig in. So there are a bunch of ways to sort of get our arms around this big question of the climate dimensions of fossil fuel exports in the Pacific Northwest. I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but I will talk about some of the majors. And before I do that, I'm under the impression that most of the folks in the audience today are sort of fairly well versed in climate science, but I do often begin conversations like this one with a look at the sort of Armageddon-like scenarios that climate change could very well unleash, including flooding, drought, ocean acidification and coral reef bleaching, sea level rise, and increased forest fires. I actually don't spend a lot of my life studying the science of climate change because it's, you know, something this side of The Walking Dead, I guess, but it's not pretty. And with every new year's worth of research that we see about this, there's more cause for concern. There is new research coming out right now from the IPCC, which is the governing body of climate experts around the world, who are issuing a new consensus statement about the dangers of it. I do like to point out this is a look at 800,000 years worth of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So if you look back for the last 800,000 years, you can see that it goes up and down by quite a bit because we've had warmer and cooler periods, some ice ages, and some really fun tropical times. On the far right, though, you can see that present day concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide far exceed anything that we've seen since human beings have wandered the face of this earth. So if we continue to increase by large amounts the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is the principal method by which humans warm the planet, we will be looking forward to a future that looks nothing like the past that us and our evolutionary ancestors have inhabited. I'm not going to spend much more time talking about climate science because my goal today is not to freak everybody out, but to give you a sense of how we in this region have a very particular kind of opportunity in front of us. You could think about this as a pressing danger, but I'm willfully naive or professionally Pollyanna or something. And I really do believe that we here in the Pacific Northwest have an opportunity in front of us that is rarely presented to a region. I'm going to show this map several times today, and I like to say that this map is wildly too simplistic, totally reductionist, and 100% accurate. And the reason I say that is because I think it defines the simple geophysical reality that we're facing in this region. It does not, of course, express all of the various nuances of the energy economy, but it expresses one very important truth. And I'm going to walk you through the map right now so that every time you see this map during the course of my talk, it's going to make some kind of sense, I hope. On the right-hand side, you can see four darker blobs. Those represent three dark blobs. Those three blobs represent the big fossil fuel deposits that are in the center, roughly the center of North America. In the north, the Athabascan tar sands, the oil sands of Canada. In the center, the shale oil in North Dakota. And in the south, the Powder River Basin coal deposits. All of those fossil fuel deposits are loaded with carbon. When combusted, they would emit large quantities of carbon dioxide. They tend to be far from markets for various reasons that are unpopular or uneconomic. If you look at the other side of the map, that's Asia, the world's hungriest energy markets, the world's most dynamic energy markets. And what the Pacific Northwest is facing right now are proposals to dig up all of that stuff, much of it, and send it to Asia for combustion. That means that it would have to travel through the Pacific Northwest because much of the stuff is heavy, bulky, or relies on hard infrastructure that's expensive to build. And so as a consequence, if that stuff is going to be dug up and burned, it has to travel through what is, I think, inarguably, the greenest corner of modern civilization. This is the region that has, in many ways, given birth to the modern environmental movement. And curiously, there's the region that is least dependent on fossil fuels for its own economy. This is a region that has not only historically been based on cleaner sources of energy, on cleaner sources of economic activity, but has taken some of the most aggressive strides to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels anyway. And so we are in this very peculiar place where one of the biggest debates that we're having in this country, in this continent, in the world about the future of fossil fuels is going to happen in a place that is probably the most naturally hostile to the fossil fuel industry. And that's weird and cool in a way. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. But I do want to spend just a moment more underscoring the gravity of the problem or the opportunity. And that's to say we've got 2 or 3 oil pipeline proposals depending on how you do the counting in British Columbia. We've got, 4 new coal export proposals in this region, plus some expansion proposals. We've got a huge number of oil train proposals I'll talk about a little bit more later on today. We've got at least 5 natural gas pipeline proposals. If you take all the fuel that would be moved in those projects, and you just figured out how much carbon was in the fuel, and added it all up, and then compared all that carbon to what is today definitely the sort of the benchmark of environmental politics, that's the Keystone XL pipeline. I should say a word more about the Keystone. The Keystone is a huge oil pipeline that moves Canadian oil down to the Gulf Coast. It has become the signature issue of today's modern environmental fight. It's the biggest issue, environmentally speaking, that's facing President Obama. And it's often his approval or disapproval of the Keystone XL will be held up to a large extent as one of the major features of his environmental legacy. But if you compare the Keystone to what the Pacific Northwest is looking at right now, it's actually 3 to 7 times as big as the Keystone, what we're looking at right here in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. It's about 7 times the initial build out of that pipeline configuration. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Keystone later on. But suffice it to say that the decisions we're making here right now dwarf even the biggest environmental questions that are on President Obama's desk. And that is also either really cool or really frightening or something, or maybe both. So how many folks in this room have followed the coal export debate in this region? Is that most of you, or some of you? Heard something about it, okay. All right, so I'm not going to belabor this too much since I think most of you know something about it. But suffice it to say that we have, in this region, and other regions too, but particularly in this region, over the last few years been embroiled in the biggest environmental fight we've had in this region probably ever, even including the old quote-unquote timber wars, where some of us folks who are now getting long in the tooth originally cut our teeth when we were younger environmental folks. But the coal export debate we're having now is much, much bigger even than those old fights. What's happened is, for various reasons, the U.S. coal industry, which was long considered what we all called it king coal, it's in a tailspin. It's in a tailspin for 2 reasons. The first reason is that we've incrementally added to the cost of burning coal through health and environmental regulations that are very important for protecting not only the environment, but our children and ourselves from all the pollution that derives from burning coal, or is derived from burning coal. The other thing that has put the coal industry on its tail is that we have, in very recent years, unleashed a flood of cheap natural gas, some of which is extracted from fracking. And so coal, which was long the dominant energy source in America and was long considered to be a stable and dependable source of power and also of investment, if you're on Wall Street, is now in a nosedive from which it will never recover. And if you, like me, spend any time reading earnings reports or talking to investors on Wall Street, stock prices have tumbled. They're at a fraction of levels they were just a few years ago. They're not coming back. Wall Street is moving out of coal in a big, big way. Everyone's bearish on it, and for good reason, because the domestic coal industry, as we have known it, particularly in the West, where contrary to popular belief, most coal is mined in the West, not in the East, is facing an existential sea change in the way that we think about energy in this country. But even as that stuff was changing the nature of the coal industry in North America, something was changing on the far side of the Pacific, and that was the consumer of half of all the coal that's consumed in the world annually, and that's China. China has enormous coal reserves, almost as big as the United States does. But for various reasons, in about 2009, China switched and went from being a small net exporter of coal to becoming a net importer of coal. And when the country that consumes half of all the coal in the world makes even a small change like that, it sends shockwaves to the entire industry, in fact, in many respects, to the entire Pacific sort of trade ecosystem. So when China did that, at the very moment that the U.S. coal industry took a turn for the worse, we saw in this particular region, located as we are between those big fossil deposits and Asia, saw this explosion, popcorn-like, of proposals to export coal all the way from Coos Bay to Bellingham, and actually some in British Columbia as well. That is the fight that many of us have been embroiled in for the last few years, as the coal industry has come to a region where it does not really have a home, but the coal industry is trying to get into the Northwest in a big, big way, much bigger than many other regions. And there's a whole kind of swirl of issues around that. I know many of you are engaged to at least a degree about the Longview project that's not too far away from here. What I'd like to do is highlight the environmental significance of this, because we often think, well, we burn coal's everywhere, it doesn't matter. How much does it really mean from a global warming perspective? So what I've tried to do in the next couple of slides is to translate these coal projects into the carbon emissions equivalent of the gasoline that we burn in our gas tanks, or the gasoline that we burn for anything. Okay, so if you think about 5 million tons of coal, this is 5 million tons of coal is equivalent to all of the gasoline burned in that region over the course of a year. Okay, and this is what 20 million tons of coal is equivalent to in terms of gasoline that's burned in our tanks. This is what 60 million tons. So if all the people who live in that area, all of the gasoline they burn in a year is equivalent to 60 million tons of coal, which is way less than what the industry wants to export from the Pacific Northwest. This is the equivalent of what was originally proposed for coal exports alone in the Pacific Northwest, was all of the gasoline from that region. That's the climate impact of it. It's enormous. Now, they started off with 145. We've knocked down a bunch of those projects now, so the number is smaller than that now, but it's a big, big number. And so every time that we think about the things that we try to do to reduce our carbon emissions, reduce our pollution, and so on, whether it's carpooling or taking a bus or driving a more efficient car, it's worth considering that the coal export proposals from this region all by itself would dwarf those very important efforts. But things have not only taken a turn for the worse for the domestic coal industry, they have also found that the Pacific Northwest was not a super easy place for them to do business and roll in with big export terminal proposals. And I very distinctly remember that when these projects were first being submitted to regulators, I sat down in the conference of a law room with some of the project proponents, who basically sneered at us and said, you guys are going to get steamrolled, there's nothing you can do, but why don't we make it easy on you? What would make it easier for you to just swallow this pill and move on with your lives? And we said, we don't think it's going to be that easy for you. This is not coal country, and we think we can make your life pretty hard. Now fast forward 3-4 years, and at a conference in Montana a couple of weeks ago, the coal industry said publicly, we're outmatched, we're outgunned, we're being outorganized, and we're losing in the Pacific Northwest, and we need help. We need help from the taxpayers of Brandon and Montana. That's thanks to some folks in this room right here. It's not me, it's folks on the ground, and so the applause should be back there. Suffice it to say, the dynamics of this are changing fast. I believe that we're going to defeat all of the coal export proposals in Washington and Oregon. Not everyone believes that, but I do. There's a different question in Canada about what will happen to some expansion proposals there, but suffice it to say, it is an example of where a once dominant fossil fuel industry arrived with plans that seemed undefeatable, and in fact it turns out they're very defeatable. And it's for this reason that I believe the Pacific Northwest is particularly well suited to go to battle over what I think is the defining climate issue of our generation, and that's how much fossil fuel we're going to burn. Since these projects were first rolled out, we've knocked 3 of them off the books. Grace Harbor is no longer happening. Coos Bay is no longer happening, and there was a giant one in Port Westward near Clanskye, Oregon, by a company called Kinder Morgan, for whom I have a particular hatred, and they've backed out too. So now we're down to only 100 million tons of coal. This fight will continue for a couple more years at least, and I think they will ultimately be killed off by a combination of robust citizen activism and frankly by Wall Street investors who are now on every earnings call forcing the coal companies to explain to them again, why is it you think you're going to be able to move the coal offshore? Because it doesn't look good from our perspective, is what they say. And they're really back on their heels. It's fun. Tragically though, the conversation does not end there. There are at least 3 other major sources of energy that are proposed for transport to the Northwest. There is what we call tight oil that's extracted from fracking from North Dakota. I'm going to talk about that at the end of today's talk. Tar sands oil from Alberta, which is a big one. Natural gas, largely from British Columbia. I'm not going to talk about that one at all because it's way more complex and we don't have time. But we have to engage in all of these fights, ultimately. And it's because of this geophysical reality in the map that I'm going to keep showing you over and over again until you get really bored of it. And I'll keep showing it to you anyway. So the first one I want to talk about, because it bears on the biggest issue for Vancouver, Washington, which is about oil. The first one of these I want to talk about is that northern block. That's the Athabascan tar sands. It has been called the most environmentally destructive project on Earth for a whole bunch of reasons related to water contamination and the consequences of basically mining it. If you don't spend a lot of time thinking about oil, I am jealous of you, but it is often thought that oil is sort of a single thing, a single substance or commodity, but in fact oil exists on a very wide spectrum. The oil that we kind of think about from the days of some wildcat in Oklahoma who digs a hole in the ground with a shovel and oil comes gushing out. That is really what the oil industry is like at all anymore. In the Alberta oil sands, it's actually extracted with kind of mining-like techniques. Some cases basically just strip mined out of the ground. And when it comes out, it's about the consistency of peanut butter. If you imagine taking like a glob of peanut butter and then rolling it in the sand on the beach, that's kind of what you get when you get that oil out. It's pretty nasty, gunky stuff. And so in order to turn that into stuff that we can put into our gas tanks, you have to heat it, you have to treat it with a bunch of chemicals, you have to process it in all kinds of different ways, and then you have to dilute it more, and then figure out how to ship it all the way from northern Alberta to somewhere where there are people who want to burn it. That's a big issue for them. And the major way that they've thought about moving it now, I mean, we do have Canadian tar sands now, even in our gas tanks now, but not very much compared to how much there is there, because there's a lot of oil up there in those sand deposits. The major proposal right now for moving that stuff to market is what is called the Keystone pipeline. And the Keystone XL, which is the portion that crosses the border, has been the most contentious part of this. And so if you look at sort of the middle part of the continent there, that kind of network of brightly colored lines represents the configuration of pipelines that make up the Keystone pipeline delivery, which would take oil sort of from the hardest region of Alberta across the border down to Cushing, Oklahoma, and then to refineries and port terminals on the Gulf. It's really, really big. It's about 830,000 barrels of some of the nastiest oil on Earth. And because it crosses the border, it is therefore under the jurisdiction of the State Department, which means that ultimately it's Obama's decision about whether or not we will approve or not approve of that project. And it is considered by many, appropriately so, to be kind of the benchmark environmental question of today. But if you look at the map, or you just think about geography, those of us in the Northwest are always feeling like we're overlooked by the rest of the country, because we are. There are two other ways to move that stuff out that are real live proposals. Two big pipelines in British Columbia. That northern one, the purple and pink one, there are two lines there. That's called the Northern Gateway, and then the southern one is called the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the project of Kinder Morgan, my least favorite energy company, second least favorite energy company. Both of these are huge pipelines that would take a lot of oil sands, put them on the Pacific, some theoretically for domestic use, but most for export. The reason, by the way, there are sort of two lines in that northern one is because they have to build two pipelines. One, to take the diluent material, the stuff that would dilute the nasty oil, they have to build a pipeline to take that over to Alberta, dilute the oil, and then send it back to the coast, because otherwise it's too much like sludge. With the southern one there, it shows actually the route of a pipeline that already exists. It's called the Trans Mountain, as I said. They want to roughly triple that in size, with almost all of the additional oil going offshore somewhere. So if you live in Canada, this stuff that I'm talking about now would be so obvious that everyone would have walked out the door already, because this is the defining environmental fight right now. And in fact, the defining political question in British Columbia, huge. It's all over the newspapers. It's dominated media coverage there. We don't hear very much about it south of the border, which is unfortunate, because in some ways this stuff matters every bit as much as maybe more than what we're doing here. This stuff's going to have a direct effect on us for reasons I'll talk about in a second. So that's the question of the oil pipelines. Then there's the question of oil trains, which maybe some of you have heard about, because the producers who are connected to that middle blob there. That blob sort of shows the Williston Basin, which is where the Bakken Formation is located. The Bakken is a type of oil that is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum from the tar sands oil. So where the tar sands is sort of sludge-like, the Bakken is volatile and light and exists in very different formations. So where you mine, kind of strip mine to get to tar sands oil, with the Bakken oil in North Dakota, we've known it was there for a long time, but we couldn't get at it economically. But now, in the last few years, we figured out how to drill very, very deep, in some cases a mile or 2 miles deep, and how to drill horizontally once we get down there, and then how to frack. And so fracking involves basically injecting at high pressure chemicals in water forcefully enough to break up the shale formations that are way underground. When those formations get broken up, that oil will often gush back up to the surface. By the way, sometimes contaminated with the stuff you sent down there to get it. But so it comes out is in a very light, volatile form. It does not need further processing to travel. In fact, it's almost too volatile, as we'll find out in a second. But what the producers in the Bakken region, what happened to them, they're also pretty far from markets and not sufficiently served by pipeline infrastructure for their needs. They were sort of looking at the huge, epic, endlessly delayed fight over Keystone and other pipelines, and kind of figured out, well, that can't be the best way for us to proceed and make money right away. And it turned out the railroads were perfectly willing to step in with all kinds of tank cars and begin loading that oil onto trains and taking it to markets. These developments are so recent that if I were giving this talk even 2 years ago, there would not have been a single oil train project anywhere in the Northwest and very few anywhere in the country. Since that time, they've scaled up about 57 times beyond levels they were, in 2009 or so. So these developments and the changes in the oil industry and the energy economy in general are happening extremely. It's a fascinating time to be studying it, actually. So what we're looking at in the Northwest, not on the oil or coal trains, which I've talked about some, and which we probably see here on the tracks occasionally heading to Canada, but also this question about oil trains, which you may have also seen on the tracks here, but which may scale up dramatically above current levels. And that's kind of the question where we are now. As I said, 2 years ago, there were no projects that were operating in Oregon or Washington. Now there are 10 that are under consideration. 4 I've indicated in yellow are taking oil trains now. 3 of the refineries on Puget Sound, and then a site on the Oregon side of the Columbia. And I apologize because that dot is in the wrong spot. But there are some big differences. The 5 dots you see on Puget Sound are all indicate the presence of refineries, which now receive crude oil mostly from Alaska by tanker vessel or by pipeline from BC, and refine it, and we turn it into jet fuel and gasoline and diesel and so on. That's all kind of one thing. Those are all either receiving oil trains now or probably will be receiving them soon. There's not a lot we can do about that, unfortunately. In Grace Harbor, at Hoquiam, there are 3 additional proposals to take oil trains and then put it onto the ocean somewhere. And then one here in Vancouver, which is almost as big as all the others combined. That one's enormous. It's called the Sorrow Savage Project, and I'm going to talk about that at some length in a bit. But this is really the epicenter in this region and one of the epicenters nationally of the debate over oil trains. It's a big, big deal. And in the next slide, I'm going to try to show you how big a deal it is. And I wish this slide were a little bit clearer, but so I'll walk you through it. On the left-hand side, there is a stacked column, stacked out, added together, all of the oil volumes that are planned or actually taking right now. That's the left side. Okay, so that goes up to around 800,000 barrels per day. If you go all the way over to the right-hand side of that chart, that's the Keystone XL. So it's almost as much oil in Oregon and Washington alone, by train alone, as the entire Keystone XL pipeline. And in fact, even if we said, okay, Alaska, no more tanker vessels can come to our refineries, we're not going to take any more oil by pipeline from any other source, and all we had was oil trains, we still couldn't refine all that oil here. It's actually considerably more oil than we have the capacity to refine in this region. And those 5 refineries on Puget Sound supply oil for a good chunk of Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and points beyond. But we have so many, and these are not sort of hypothetical napkin sketch proposals for oil trains. These are real live, in permitting kind of decisions that we're wrestling with right now. The point of this chart is not that, hey, that's a lot. It's that this oil is not for us. We have abundant supplies of oil that we can use now for refining for our own use. This oil is headed, not entirely, but largely elsewhere, and I would argue that it's headed abroad. I'm going to talk about that. But before I talk about that, I do like to do this slide, the yeah, but who cares slide, which is sometimes referred to as I don't believe in science slide. Like you don't care about global warming, you don't care about carbon emissions, you don't care about the environment. I do lots of talks like this to audiences where that is sort of a real concern, or they think climate change is a hoax. That's fine, whatever. I mean, it's not fine, but you don't have to be a rainbow warrior to think that this stuff is a terrible idea for the region. And so I've enumerated just a handful of the reasons why small towns in eastern Washington and chambers of commerce all across this region are freaking out about what will happen if we put large-scale coal and oil export terminals in place. We're going to have a smoking wreckage of an economy left, basically. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the non-environmental reasons why we should be concerned about this stuff. Because I think there is a very direct case that can be made to the business community and to other folks who like to have a paycheck that this is the wrong move. And then also there's the people who care about living on a planet that's hospitable. One of the nuisances from coal terminals is that they produce a lot of dust. The trains actually produce a lot of dust as well. We've sort of talked about that issue a lot. I have had the pleasure, in quotes, of visiting many coal terminals. And this is an aerial picture on Google Earth of Kinder Morgan. This is their site on the lower Mississippi, where I just got back from a couple of weeks ago. And all that black stuff trailing into the Mississippi there, that's coal and coal dust that they just allow to fall off the barges. They had a proposal for the Columbia, right? And this is their wreckage, their story, same story everywhere. This is in Alaska, about 2 miles from the coal terminal in Seward. That's a guy's boat, which is normally white. In this case, it's sort of a dusky gray because of all the coal dust that blows across the harbor. This is in Canada, this is the West Shore Terminal in Vancouver, BC. I visited this one as well. It's very, very dirty. This is a guy in Charleston, South Carolina, marine mechanic and kind of a good old boy, who also lives near Kinder Morgan coal terminal. And what he likes to do is drive around in his boat and just wipe his hands on the pilings after each tide. And he's a fisherman as well. And he's posted a lot of stuff on YouTube, and we'll just look at his hands black with the coal dust that comes off those terminals. I have often sat on stages like this and debated the coal guys, and they will say, I love this line, because they will say, yeah, so coal terminals now, yeah, they're not so great, we agree, they're legacy, they're old, but we're going to build some new ones, and they're going to be white glove operations, super clean, they're not going to affect anything. It's like a Prius. You know, you're describing old, jalopies. We're going to build you a Prius. But the response to that really is they're not trying to sell us a Prius, because I can go out to the parking lot and find a Prius right now. I can go buy one this afternoon. They're selling us a unicorn, because there is nothing like this anywhere in the world. There is no coal operation that's clean. It just doesn't exist. And so I've challenged them repeatedly and publicly to find me any example of a clean coal terminal. And so far I've heard nothing but crickets in response. Okay, pause for breath. The oil version of the coal dust question is actually nastier, because when oil contaminates water, the consequences are much more severe. I want to go back to this slide because I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how the oil moves, where it goes right now. So I'll take one example and just sort of explain how the oil moves, and I think it will sort of highlight what the risk is here. So the yellow dot at the bottom of the picture, labeled Port Westwood there, that is an existing site on the Oregon side. It's an old ethanol site that has been converted to handle crude oil. It started taking oil in December of 2012. It's actually operating way above its legally permitted capacity, which is a whole other story. So it now takes oil by train. Those trains roll through Portland, roll through Vancouver first, then Portland, then they head to Port Westwood. They take the oil off the train, put it in tanks usually, then they take it from the tanks, put it on ocean-going barges, string those up, barge them out the mouth of the Columbia over the bar, hang a right, take them up the coast, hang another right, take them back down the strait, past the San Juan Islands, and then they deliver it to a refinery, where they transfer it off the barges again, refine it, then sometimes put it back on a vessel, and then take it back out somewhere to sell it. They don't always take it back out, but sometimes they do. The other thing they do is they take it to California with kind of the same route. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that's a lot more transfers of oil over water. It's a lot more types of vessels, of oil-bearing vessels moving through fairly important areas that are ecologically important, but also economically important. And this has raised real concerns, even for the kind of Coast Guard folks who think about how do we manage and protect us against oil spills. And I haven't crunched the numbers myself, but the numbers that the folks who work in that vessel management arena quote are just staggering. It's maybe 10 times an increase in the movement of oil over these waters when you include the pipelines, and then it could be more than that. So I don't want to spend too long on it, but it is worth pointing out that oil spills happen. This is a picture of the Valdez. That's a picture of one in the San Francisco Bay. This is one that's Deepwater Horizon in New Mexico. That's Exxon Valdez again. That's one somewhere else in the east, I think. And the point is, oil spills happen. They're very, very damaging. The currents are moving fast. We have national parks. We have all kinds of stuff that we should be concerned about protecting. We have very live fishing industries as well. And it's a risk that we need to be thinking about a lot more because we're not adequately protected against it now. Puget Sound is actually maybe the national model for thinking about oil spill response and oil spill program prevention. The Columbia is not like that. Neither state has spent nearly as much time thinking about and developing programs and funding sources that would allow us to respond to an oil spill here. So if it were to happen here on the outer coast, we'd be in a world of hurt. And that's a real risk. I feel like I'm going fast, but tough. So that's the environmental stuff, right? I told you that there were lots of environmental reasons not to want coal and oil trains in our communities. And this is one of them. This is sort of the high school story problem math, and this stuff is really irrefutable. And there's even the industry guys have to kind of shrug their shoulders and go along with this. These are maps. There's a map of Washougal, downtown Vancouver, or the sort of east of Vancouver there. And I think what else did I put? Just outside Vancouver. And what I've done basically is I've mapped places where streets cross the rail lines. Okay, and that there are street crossings all the way from the lines to the terminals. And then you can just think about, well, how much coal can fit in a gondola, which is the rail car that they use? How many would you have to string together to deliver that much coal? And how many trains would you have to run to deliver all that? So you did the same for oil. It's pretty simple math. The figures are indisputable. And then the only thing you need to know is how fast the trains travel. And we know how fast they travel. And when you do the math for all that stuff, you have to close those streets 2 to 4 hours every single day, 365 days a year, just to deliver the coal and oil, not for other trains, just for those trains. And you have to do that in Spokane, you have to do it in little towns, you have to do it in Tri-Cities, Vancouver, blah, 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 blah. It becomes a really big deal, particularly in urban areas where trains can't travel very fast because it's too dangerous for whatever reason. So I grew up in Seattle. We have trains that run right through the heart of downtown Seattle. There are 4 major streets, several of which are critical for trucking industries near the seaport. And when we were young, stupid high schoolers, which I'm sure none of you ever were, we used to occasionally run alongside the trains and jump on them. That's how slow they go. They're 10, 15 miles an hour, okay? It's actually a terrible idea to do that. And apparently people use their legs doing that, but we used to do it all the time, and we thought it was funny. But they're only traveling like, so you can run alongside at the same pace of the train and then just jump up on it. I have a kid now, and that terrifies me, but suffice it to say, when you do that, you are taking, in the case of Seattle, but Vancouver's like this too, major industrial areas that produce a lot of jobs, that move a lot of goods, that support a lot of economic activity, and you're going to take the streets and you're going to barricade them off, hours every day. That is not a value proposition for the economy. I don't care what you think about global warming. That's just a bad deal. What's the economic benefit to any town that these trains travel through? They don't get any of the jobs. All they get is downside. And so this is a case statement that I think we should all be making more often because it's a place where we have common cause. This is just a look at some of the math. I think this is the one that's specifically for this region. So I've tried to do little kind of tabular calculations for each region that these trains will go through. And the idea here is that, depending on what assumptions you make about train speeds, whether it's 20 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour, being generous because they can often travel much, much slower than that. There's just nothing you can say about it. It's going to be hours a day of street closures. Also annoying if you like to move. The other side of this is that there's congestion not just on the streets, but there's congestion on the rail lines as well. This is a map that shows all of the what are called the Class 1 railways, the major railways in Washington. And this is produced by Cambridge Systematics, a firm from back east that does complex modeling of transportation systems. And they color-coded the state according to rail congestion. Red is obviously congested, and the others should be yellows, medium, and green is fine. This Vancouver region ends up being a pretty major source of congestion. In fact, a bunch of money has been spent here reconfiguring the rail yards and other things to ease some of those bottlenecks. This is under existing rail traffic, okay? Now there are places, north of Everett, for example, where you could take every train off the tracks right now, all of them, Amtrak trains, every freight train off the tracks, and you still could not move all the coal and oil trains that are planned on the existing tracks. Which raises real questions about what we do in a trade-dependent region that moves grain to the ports, that moves container cargo out of the ports. I mean, how do we manage an infrastructure that supports our economy when we have coal and oil trains planned here that would swamp everything on the tracks right now? As it happens, it ends up the taxpayers, as with the street congestion, end up picking up the tab for that stuff in ways that are both direct and indirect. What you have is basically governments will provide subsidies, as I said, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect, that can add up to hundreds of millions of dollars in order to enable us to sit in traffic for longer. And that's a real problem. So you can take a look. This is not my analysis, this is Cambridge Systematics who did it for the state Department of Transportation. They're basically identifying all of the choke points, and there are a bunch in Southwest Washington. But I do think it's worth, again, bringing to light why this is important. I like this picture of Warren Buffett because there was a time a few years ago when, so the thing about Warren Buffett, right, and if you are in finance or economics, you probably know that Warren Buffett is considered a great investor, not only because he has a lot of money, but because he's always been right when everyone else has been wrong. And there have been times when he has sold when everyone else is buying or bought when everyone else has been selling. And he got one thing, he's gotten a couple things really, really right about this that very few other people saw. There was a time, not many years ago, when the railroads were sucking the drain. Oh, you know what that is? I'm going to have to plug in the power source. I'm sorry about that. Hold that thought and look at Warren Buffett. I realize I'm on video right now. I hope so. Okay, this just made my top 10 of most embarrassing public speaking moments.
Oh, you're doing great then.
So there was a time, not many years ago, when folks thought railroads were circling the drain. It was a legacy industry. Nobody wanted to buy them. But Warren Buffett was able to see that that wasn't necessarily the case. He bought BNSF railroads. He bought them outright. He has a 100% equity stake in them under his Berkshire Hathaway investment group. BNSF is the railroad that plays in Washington. They own essentially all of our infrastructure here. And he also bought a bunch of a $500 million equity stake in a tar sands firm in Canada. And he also bought the manufacturers and leasers of oil tank cars. So he's got interests all up and down the supply chain. And he was on CNBC a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to actually read his quotes because I love studying this guy. All of the rails have done well recently. It's a business that has real economic advantages, he said modestly, because he's made a ton of money on this stuff. And the interviewer pressed him and said, well, haven't we had some problems with the oil trains? Aren't they dangerous? And he said, well, we have found in the last year or so that it's more dangerous to move certain types of crude, certainly, than was thought previously. And I love that he put that in the passive voice, than was thought previously. By who? And the interviewer pressed him again and said, come on, didn't one of them blow up and kill a bunch of people? And he said, well, yeah, there are leaks on pipelines, which wasn't the subject. And the occasional explosion, like that's very, 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 very rare. Which is completely irrelevant, how rare it is, when the people who used to live in this town in Quebec which was incinerated last summer when an oil train blew up and killed 47 people and left 4 blocks of town smoking rubble. This oil train was carrying the exact same kind of oil in the exact same kind of tanker cars that are in Vancouver right now and that are proposed to increase dramatically. Okay, that was last summer. And the reason that this happened was A, the oil is dangerous, B, the tank cars are unsafe, and C, we've increased oil train shipments by about 57 times above levels that we have used them in the past. Since that explosion happened, this one happened in November in Alabama, in a rural area, thank God. It fell off into the river there, unfortunately. This one happened in North Dakota in December. I'm going to show you a video of this one later on because there were a lot of people driving on the highway just outside Fargo and took video camera shots of it. If that had happened a few miles down the track in Fargo, the death toll would have been staggering. This one happened in New Brunswick in January. These are real problems. We've had some others, not on quite this scale. One actually derailed in Philadelphia and did not explode, but it was the same thing, and it could easily explode. Had it exploded in Philadelphia, I don't know. I mean, it would. You can fill in the blanks, but it would not have been good. Real problem with this stuff. And my contention is that there are lots of folks who, again, don't necessarily care about environmental issues or about global warming, but who belong to what I like to call the anti-incineration caucus. I am part of that caucus. I have no desire to be incinerated anytime soon. But I'm going to be spending a good chunk of Sunday afternoon at the Safeco Field right there, where that coal train is sitting in this picture. You can imagine what would happen if an oil train derailed in an urban area like that with tens of thousands of sports fans next door, or just ordinary folks. My son's only 5, but I think I put him in the anti-incineration category too. And this is a real issue. People are freaking out about this stuff. And there are reasons why we should draw some attention, I think, to the very real public safety risks of moving oil by rail. It's not the conversation I want to have, which is about the risks of disruptive climate change. But there is common cause within a lot of folks about simply managing what the oil industry has unleashed. I'm going to end the talk in just 1 second. Seattle, Spokane, and Bellingham have recently passed resolutions saying we want to time out from this stuff. Don't move it unless we know it's not going to blow us all to smithereens. Vancouver, the city, is going to be considering that in the next few weeks. Is that right, Doc? Next few weeks. And it's critically important. This is probably the most important near-term thing you can do, is to get yourself to City Hall when that happens, pack the hearing room, and demand that we take a time out until we can move this stuff and not blow ourselves up. I think it's the least we can do. There's a lot more, but that's a very good near-term step. I'm going to end it there. We're going to do Q&A for a while. There are a whole bunch of dimensions to this stuff I didn't talk about that I'd be delighted to dig into. But before I wrap it up, I'm going to show you like a 3 or 4 minute video. This is so self-aggrandizing because I'm in the video. But it's got some really cool footage, which is why I'm showing it to you. And then after that, we'll do Q&A.
The Pacific Northwest stands at a crossroads.
False. Or true, but on video. Here we go.
I'm really concerned about the crude oil trains that are running through here. Every day, there's massive increases in these trains proposed. I live a third of a mile from these tracks. The tracks run literally right through the center of Rainier, and in order to back out of your parking place, you have to back up over the tracks.
2 trains collide in a fiery crash in North Dakota.
In November, a 90-car train derailed in Alabama. In a derailment in Quebec last July, killed 47 people.
The parked train came loose, picked up speed, roared off the tracks, and exploded in the middle of the night. Burnt rail tankers are still steaming in the heart of Lac-Mégantic, Quebec.
If there were an oil train explosion here or near my house, we would all be vaporized.
Right now, the Northwest stands at a threshold, and the explosion in Quebec should be seen as a cautionary tale really for other communities, because we've got schemes right now on the drawing board for 10 port terminals and refineries that want to take oil trains, all from North Dakota, all carrying the same type of combustible anywhere near this capacity before. In the Pacific Northwest alone, we're looking at 10, 11, 12 loaded oil trains each and every day. All of it originates in North Dakota from the Bakken Formation and heads down to the Columbia, to the Port of Vancouver, or westward in Oregon, Grays Harbor, and the 5 refineries along Puget Sound shorelines. It's extremely difficult to imagine how first responders would deal with a situation where you had an oil train exploding in central Seattle or Vancouver, Washington. There just isn't very many places for people to go.
I'm the president of Offshore Local Forum Vancouver. Oil export terminals don't employ a lot of people. They take a lot of land and there's not a lot of people working per acre. So with the oil terminal coming into Port of Vancouver, Longshore would be the guys tying out and letting the ships go. But our local said, you know what, no, the risk isn't worth the reward. We don't believe in jobs at any cost. You know, one accident there puts us out of work, period. And it'll put thousands of people out of work. You got oil in the water, you're not moving anything until it's cleaned up. And we've seen over and over again, they don't do it quickly. I mean, it seems like it's just a matter of time before something bad's going to happen. And it would be something that I would worry about, taking kids down to the heart of Vancouver, you know.
I'm a new grandmother, and I want my grandson to be able to grow up in a place where he doesn't have to worry about oil trains exploding. This is an issue for Rainier, Oregon, Washington, and the entire nation. Please sign this petition opposing dangerous crude oil trains.
It was made by a local filmmaker, a guy named Trip Jennings in Portland. Just really cool stuff. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to me. We can do Q&A now. Questions? Don.
What is the status of the proposed oil terminals in Puget? Could Governor easily stop any of it?
On Puget Sound, all of the projects are actually at refineries. 3 of them are operating already. 1 possibly in excess of its permits. 1 is in construction now, and the final one will have to go through permitting soon. So it's very difficult to imagine stopping those, which is going to mean that there'll be some number of oil trains traveling through Vancouver and Seattle every day. But the choice that we're looking at is what happens in Grays Harbor and here in Vancouver, because those are the really big projects, much, much bigger than those on Puget Sound. And those are the ones where we have a chance to, for the governor to stop them and for us to stop them, quite honestly. But tragically, some of the horse are out of the barn before we're able to stop delivery to the refiners. Thank you for asking. Yes?
What policies are in place right now that let this keep going, and what are the ones that are proposed? I know you talked about the city hall thing, but what's it actually called? Like, what's is there like are they going to pass a policy?
Here in Vancouver?
In general, just how does this apply to what's the policy behind?
I see. So there are a bunch of sort of factors at work, but there's actually not sort of, it's not like we've got to pass this law or we're going to not let this law get passed. It's not that kind of debate. It's like, it's a debate over infrastructure, basically. It's about whether we're going to allow them to build giant terminals to ship this stuff. So with respect to the debate that's happening here, it's in many ways a question for the local community, or the local port rather. Are we going to allow them to construct a facility that will handle 360,000 barrels of crude per day or not? At the macro sort of national level, there is a lively debate about how does we regulate tank cars and railroads and think about imports and exports. But again, there's not like a single policy so much. Although there is one that leaps to mind. We have what is often referred to now as a ban on exporting crude oil from the U.S. So for decades now, oil that's produced in the U.S. Has to stay in the U.S. or Canada or the Virgin Islands for consumption. And then we import some to supplement that. As we have seen an increase in production from the Alberta tar sands and from places like North Dakota, the oil industry, which often likes to wave the flag of energy independence, has now begun lobbying in Congress to lift that ban so that we can export it. So that would mean that, because why would you move all that oil to a place like Vancouver that's 150 miles from the refinery, unless you wanted to export it? It wouldn't make any sense economically or sort of logistically. The oil that's destined for here is destined to be sold abroad. But the oil industry hasn't yet got that ban lifted. So that's one to really keep our eyes on. That's going to be a very lively debate in the coming years. I don't know how it's going to turn out at all. And we can also, I should say, export Canadian oil. So this could be a depot for Canadian oil. There's no restriction on that right now. Sort of a convoluted answer, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Who benefits from all the oil and coal exports?
Well, the oil industry, I mean, they are the most profitable industry on the planet, and they make a lot of money doing this. And then some of the folks who, move the oil to market, so Warren Buffett makes a non-trivial sum of money moving oil trains, because he gets to build the tank cars, then he gets to lease them, then he gets to charge the oil companies to ship. So if you buy oil stocks, you might benefit a little bit. But no, we don't get anything. We get some tax revenue from the operations of the terminal, but there are very few jobs. There's very little direct economic plus for it. We don't produce any oil. We refine some of it. It's almost all economic downside for places like this, which I think is an argument that we need to be making more of, quite honestly. It's a great question. Yeah, let's go over here.
So there's a tradition of the railroad industry receiving, direct and indirect government subsidy, the original land for railroads, and that history along with that. Given that there need to be a lot of changes in railroad infrastructure in the Northwest, transportation changes at crossings, but also quality of track and so on, is there a sort of a developer pays principle in railroad infrastructure now, or is that still infrastructure that would be improved with some support from government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are whole books written about the ways in which the U.S. government taxpayers subsidize the formation of the railroads in this country. But what's I think less well known, as you suggest, is that we right now have active government and taxpayer subsidies of the freight rail infrastructure. The industry actually will sometimes deny that. They will say flatly that they don't take taxpayer subsidies, which is false 9 ways from Sunday. So we build with taxpayer money sidings so that they can move longer trains like coal trains. We build rail yards, or we contribute to paying railroads. When we have to do something with the street configuration so that we can get around the 4 hours of traffic congestion a day, that's virtually every penny of that is on taxpayers. So there's every reason to think that the industry is going to be at the trough looking for more taxpayer handouts. There's a guy, a reporter in Washington, D.C., who reports from McClatchy newspapers, they have actually newspapers all over the country. His name is Curtis Tate, and he has done, it's worth looking him up later on, because he has done absolutely first-rate reporting on the ways in which the railroad industry has taken hundreds of millions of dollars in pretty direct subsidies from the government, and then put them to use making money basically shipping freight. Including, he did a really interesting couple of piece segment recently in the way in which they took Obama's stimulus money that was designated for high-speed passenger rail in some eastern corridors, and were able to repurpose that basically as a direct subsidy for freight operations. All the while running commercials inside the Beltway in DC about how they don't take any money from taxpayers. And so Curtis Tate and others like this have really gone to town on spelling out the ways that they do this. It's fascinating stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
My question is kind of more of a clarification question, but so we're going to have to deal with 2 to 4 hours of congestion, the threat of explosions and all that stuff, and we're really not going to benefit at all from in this area.
I like the way you said that. Yeah.
So we're going to bear all of the negative stuff and not have any kind of
it's hard. I mean, it is, to Sorrow and Savage, who are the proposal proponents, they will give you a list of things that are going to be groovy when they build this terminal. There'll be some additional tax revenue, a few jobs, and so on. But
nothing significant.
no, I mean, vastly outweighed by economic harm, not to mention environmental risk. vastly outweigh. It's not even close in my opinion. Yeah.
So, say we get, we manage to stop the development of all this stuff that we're talking about. Is there any indication that, like, where they'll go as an alternative, or is that going to be enough of a, we don't want it in this area that's actually going to have a pretty big impact on use of fossil fuels in general, or are they just going to take it like to California or something?
So there are smaller versions of this debate happening in California right now, particularly in the Bay Area. What's interesting is, and so I think when I showed you the map the first time, I said this is wildly overly simplistic, right? There are oil trains moving in various parts of the country to the mid-Atlantic refineries, down to the Gulf Coast and other places. But really the major play, in my view, is off the West Coast, because and the reason they're trying to lift the export ban, largely, and there's nuance I'm skipping here, but is because they want to move it to Asian markets, right? Which means that they've got to build infrastructure through the West Coast somewhere. California is really far out of the way. It'd be a long rail haulage. It's expensive to do that. Pipeline too far. So it's going to be oil pipelines in British Columbia, oil trains in Washington. And that's kind of the play. So if we bottle this stuff up here, I think there's I'm being too simplistic, but it's kind of true that if we bottle it up here, if we say no to it here, it stays in the ground. And that's big. That's a big win for the climate. And it puts the oil industry back on its heels. And the oil industry's influence in politics is pretty nasty. I think they're beatable, and especially because they're going to have a fight on it's not their home turf, it's our home turf. And I think we're going to make it difficult for them at least. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah?
Shy of actually building a terminal, is there a way to work with city governments to not, because even if they don't build a terminal here in Vancouver, if they build it up in Puget Sound, so there are trains coming through, is there a way to stop all those trains from just using rails in our area?
Yeah, so, I mean, you could physically block them illegally, but I'm not suggesting that, by the way, for the camera. Although one could physically block the rails illegally. The problem we're facing is that we don't have regulatory authority really over the railroads. One of the things I sort of forgot to say is that when you look at all those places where we're going to have traffic congestion and tie-ups, there's nothing you can do about it. You can do nothing. You can sit there and watch your life tick by while the trains go. And the railroad has an enormous amount of power that it makes it very, very difficult for state and local governments to regulate them. Now, that's a huge problem. It has to be solved at the federal level. What we can do is prevent them from having a destination for it. And if there's not a destination for it, then the trains don't roll. And so what we have to do then is make sure they don't have a destination up and down, basically the Pacific Northwest coastline. It's sort of the same fight we're having with coal. We can't stop the coal trains per se, but we can stop them from having a destination. And so what that means is a real organized ground game in local communities all across the Northwest. And as it turns out, we're actually pretty good at that. Not me, but like the folks in the back of the room and other folks in this region are super good at that stuff. And it's a real problem for the industry. Yeah.
I just want to say that having attended some of the hearings around the coal train has been such a powerful kind of show of community resistance and critique. And I'm just wondering if you can say more about some of the forms that the resistance has taken in these various communities around the Pacific Northwest that have so effectively, beaten back some of these proposals at least.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so there are lots and lots of ways to engage on this in your local community. Packing City Hall soon in support of a resolution opposing oil trains would be a big step. When we get underway with sort of the permitting process for the proposals here and elsewhere, it is very important. It matters if you can show up at the hearings, if you can submit public comment, if you can provide written testimony. That stuff matters. It really does get added up into the ledgers. In the case of the oil terminal here in particular, it's kind of a curious beast because it's not permitted in a normal way. There's an agency called FSEC, long acronym, but it's a sort of a one-stop permitting shop, and the decision is ultimately made by the governor. They make a recommendation to the governor. It goes on his desk. Very unusual, and he will sort of look at the recommendation and say yes or no to it, or no but or yes but. But so there is a way in which we can think about the governor's office as being the final backstop that's going to prevent this from happening. Now, I don't think it's going to get to his desk. I think we're going to stop it before then. But lots and lots of ways to engage. And I think you can encourage all kinds of churches, business groups, student organizations, all that stuff. That public outcry matters. I'm a think tank geek. I'm not a grassroots organizer. But when I went to some of the coal terminal hearings, I mean, we're talking about thousands of people packing the halls, flowing out into the halls. People, old, young ranchers from Wyoming who hate the coal companies. I mean, it's really pretty exciting. And we're going to do the same thing on oil, for sure. And some of it's not going to be environmentalists. Some of it's going to be people who don't want to get burned up. And they've got a place at the table, too, in my opinion. I don't want to get burned up. And the unions are on our side, as we saw with the video, too. Other questions?
Yes, one more. Port of Vancouver. What have you heard from or interacted with the Port of Vancouver on the coal trains?
Port of Vancouver on coal trains?
Yeah, I'm sorry, on the oil trains.
On the oil trains, I have not personally interacted with the Port of Vancouver much on oil trains. They have, all the indications we get from the port are that they're, for the most part, supportive of developing a big oil terminal. I think that the business community here and elsewhere will turn against it. Not that the business community is the only voice that matters, but it does carry some weight. The city government should definitely weigh in strongly in opposition to it. I think that will happen. And I would say too that one of the things that I hope to be doing over the next few weeks and few months is to bring more information to light about about Tesoro, who's the project proponent for that site. They are a terrible corporation. They have a track record of safety and flaws, law-breaking, anti-worker stuff that would blow your mind. And I will be writing more about them in the coming weeks and sharing that information with local folks in Vancouver. They recently had a refinery fire in Anacortes. 7 people died, and when the U.S. federal safety investigators released the report, after getting the largest fine in state history for worker safety violations, I mean, the rap sheet that the feds produced on just that refinery operations it's really frightening, to be honest with you. They have had, in the last couple of months, workers in a refinery in California seriously burned with sulfuric acid from compromised systems in the refinery. They actually barred the gates and refused to let the federal safety investigators on site to figure out what happened. So they're a black hat in an industry that's not so great anyway. And I think the more folks know about Tesoro in a local community like this in Vancouver, the less likely people are going to want to invite them in to do business here because they don't have a place here. Other questions? I'm going to get ranting. Go ahead. Yes.
Do you anticipate that a successful blocking of these proposals in the Pacific Northwest, and thus kind of stopping all the production in the first place, will directly influence or propel the alternative generation industry? Is that part of the long-term thinking? Because our demand currently outpaces our generation capability, so we have to get it from somewhere. So by stopping those, we're going to produce.
I don't know how direct the linkage is, but I do think we are often too pessimistic about this stuff for 2 reasons. One, we have been, we're sort of always in this hand-wringing stage of like, how are we going to transition our electricity portfolio to something cleaner and better? But the transition is happening. Like, we're getting there in a whole number of ways, through efficiency, through small-scale renewables, through large-scale renewables, some transition to gas, a bunch of things. We're totally making progress on that stuff. When we think about transportation fuels, most people don't realize this. Refined product consumption, gasoline, diesel, not diesel so much, but gasoline consumption, oil consumption is declining. It's been declining for years in Washington. We're using less gasoline, and kind of significantly so. And we have been for years now. Every year it goes down a little bit. And people don't realize that we're actually managing to make incremental progress. It's not all because we started carpooling and trying to do good for the earth. Some of it's that gas prices are high. So there's a link, but I'm not sure it's a direct link. Like, in addition to stopping this stuff, we also need to go figure out how to do good stuff and come up with cleaner sources of sustainable energy. I'm all for that, but that's not what I'm going to be doing for the next year or so. Other folks are going to do that, I hope.